In the year 500 BC, a Chinese philosopher and general by the name of Sun Tzu declared these words. And I think very interesting words in light of this series. Fits in very well with this whole series that, of course, we've entitled Know Thine Enemy. Here are the words he declared in 500 BC. Quote, "If a man knows himself and knows his opponent, he need not fear 100 battles. If a man knows himself and knows not his opponent, for every victory he will suffer a defeat. And if a man knows neither himself nor his opponent, he is a fool and will suffer defeat in every battle." End quote. You know, that quote by this general Sun Tzu certainly fits in very well with the familiar passage that we have in Hosea 4 and verse 6, where it says, "My people are destroyed for a lack of knowledge." And certainly he describes the lack of knowledge in these different forms. Matter of fact, General Sun Tzu describes three different conditions in that statement. He describes the condition of knowing yourself and knowing your enemy. He describes the condition of knowing yourself and knowing not your enemy. And he describes the condition of knowing not yourself and knowing not your enemy as well. Now, let me just ask a question in light of those three conditions that this Chinese general described there in late BC. Which of those three conditions that he describes best fits the majority of Christian Israel today? The last one. Because they know neither themselves, for the most part, they know neither themselves nor their enemy. First of all, let's just deal with that just for a little bit. First of all, they know not themselves. The majority, and again, I'm talking specifically about Christian Israel. They know not themselves because the majority, and in more ways than just one, but most specifically in regards to this message, most specifically, they know not themselves because they have lost their identity and who they are. They don't know their lineage and who they go back to. They can't go back, as the Scripture admonishes us to do. They can't go back to the pit from which they were dug. It uses some other, in that passage, it uses some other, how does it describe it? The pit from which they're dug, and anybody else remember? I quoted that or shared it a few messages back. Anyway, they can't go back. It was talking about Abraham and Sarah. They can't go back because they don't know that that's where they come from. They've lost their identity, that they are Israel. Let's turn with me to 1 Corinthians chapter 10:1, and I think it really points out the importance, again, in a very simple way. It points out, or Paul points out, the importance of knowing who we are. 1 Corinthians chapter 10, in just verse 1, we find these words. He says, "For I do not want you to be unaware, brethren," or I like the King James Version a little bit better. It says, "For I do not want you to be ignorant, brethren, that our fathers were all under the cloud and all passed through the sea." Now, what's he referring back to? Obviously, he's referring back to the Exodus. Now, what's the emphasis of what he's saying in this passage? Note again, he says, "For I do not want you to be ignorant, brethren, that our fathers were all under the cloud and passed through the sea." Do you think that those people at that time were ignorant of the fact of the Exodus? That they didn't know that the Exodus had taken place? I doubt that there was hardly anybody that didn't know of the Exodus. They may have called it the myth of the Exodus, but they knew of the Exodus. I don't think he's saying here that he's speaking to these Christians in Corinth and telling them, "I don't want you to be ignorant of what happened back then." They knew what happened back then. The emphasis of this passage is on one particular word. It says, "For I do not want you to be unaware, brethren, that our fathers were all under the cloud and all passed through the sea." The book of Corinthians is normally taken to have been written to the Gentiles. And most specifically, without question, according to this passage, Gentiles, with the correct understanding for the word Gentiles of the dispersed Israel, or Israelites. He was saying, there was no question that Israel had been divorced by God, the house of Israel, and had been dispersed among the Gentiles, And in so doing, the passages make it very clear that she was to lose her identity. But the time would come, according to other prophecies, especially as found in, for example, Ezekiel 37. The time would come when their identity would start to be revealed to them once again. And that time was when Christ would once again unite the house of Judah and the house of Israel. When God, rather, would unite the house of Judah and the house of Israel under one king, Yahshua the Christ. That's the emphasis of Ezekiel 37 and Hosea 1 and 2 and other prophecies that we find in the Old Testament. And here is Paul revealing to these people, telling them, I don't want you to be ignorant of the fact of your identity, of who you are. You're Israel. It was our fathers who passed through the sea and were under the cloud. And then, of course, he goes on to explain much more in the rest of the passage. I don't know if you caught it, but in the three conditions that General Sun Tzu describes in that statement, I don't know if you caught it, but according to General Kunshaw, knowing yourself is actually of greater importance than even knowing your enemy. That if you don't know yourself, basically, the last condition is worse, when you know neither yourself nor your enemy. That's the worst. But next to that, not even knowing yourself is the absolute worst. You can know your enemy, but if you don't know who you are, you've already started to lose the battle in a major way. For those who want to say that knowing our identity is not that important, they need to take heed to that understanding. When you've lost your identity, either as an individual or as a nation or a race of people, when you've lost your identity, think about this, you really have very little to rally to or to rally under. You've lost your identity. Let alone coming to battle, to be in a force in the battle, whatever battle it may be. I think of the Russians over in communist Russia now. In all, you think about the people, not the ruling elite over there, but the people themselves. They've lost their identity. Do you think those people are going to rally behind, a communist revolution somewhere else in the country? They've got their armies, their paid armies that do their work. The people, if you think about it, the people have lost their identity of who they are and who they are and what they are. They've been conquered. They've lost their identity. And I think it's a very good example that when you lose your identity, you don't have anything to rally to, either as an individual or as a person, either as an individual or a nation. How much more likely it would be in light of that, how much more likely it would be that our young people today would rally to Yahshua, their commander-in-chief, if they only knew their identity as the offspring of Abraham. I think our young people would be so much more inclined, if they knew who they were, if they had the grip of their identity, to rally again to their commander-in-chief. It is vitally important that we understand and know who we are. Israel today, regretfully, in spite of Paul identifying who they were, Israel today, for the most part, has lost her identity. She knows not herself. Not only that, but we not only do not know ourselves, we neither know our enemy either. We do not know ourselves, neither do we, for the most part, know our enemies. I would be to God that the same statement that Paul made to the first century Corinthian Christians in 2 Corinthians chapter 2 and verse 11 could also be made for Christians today. 2 Corinthians chapter 2. You won't have to turn there. It says that no advantage be taken of us by Satan. And let's recognize that word Satan certainly was not translated. It was transliterated, and it should have been translated the adversary. Let's just read it with that translation. It says that no advantage be taken of us by the adversary, for we are not ignorant of his schemes. Would be to God again that same statement could be made for Christian Israel today. That they would not be today ignorant of the adversary or the adversaries, however you want to look at it, of the adversary's schemes. We are ignorant, sad to say, for the most part. Christian Israel, is ignorant of the adversary's schemes. Christian Israel far as that goes, for the most part, is not only ignorant of the schemes of her enemy, but in so many ways is even ignorant or unaware of the fact that she even has enemies. You know, I pray to God that this ministry that God has seen fit to start here would be used for, first of all, to point our people to Yahshua, their commander-in-chief. Above everything else, I pray to God that that's what this ministry will do. Secondly, I also pray that it would also open the eyes of our people to who they are, to their identity. And secondly, that this ministry would reveal the identity as well of our enemies and the dangers that we face because of them. Of course, this series, Know Thine Enemy, Part 10, is where we're at. Know Thine Enemy is designed to accomplish the third objective, and that is to make our people aware, to alert them to who our enemies are and what their designs for us are. Thus far in this series, we've examined communism, Masonry, and humanism, and have exposed the enemy that's behind all three. You know, following the last three messages, we dealt with humanism, and following on the heels of humanism, it is most natural for us to next investigate the so-called New Age movement. For the New Age movement, as one author put it, the New Age movement is nothing more than humanism done up in flashy colors. They're nearly one and the same, with some differences, but nearly one and the same. Now, let's begin. Let's, as we have in the past with the other areas, let's begin by examining, before looking at who's behind the scenes as far as New Ageism, as I am going to be calling it throughout this message. Before looking to see who's behind the scenes as far as New Ageism is concerned, let's first do an examination of what New Age is. Matter of fact, first I want to start with not necessarily what New Age is, but I want to first examine what New Ageism is not. And what it is not is new. They may want to call it new. It's called the New Age, but the one thing it is not is that it is new. It is not new. Ecclesiastes 1:9. You could sum it up with this passage all alone. Ecclesiastes 1:9 says, "That which has been done is that which will be, and that which has been is that which will be, and that which has been done is that which will be done." So there is nothing new under the sun. And if that ever fit anything, it fits the New Age movement. They may claim it to be new, but it certainly is not new. New Ageism is nothing but an extension of humanism, as we found out through both through Humanist Manifesto number 1 and Humanist Manifesto number 2. In the introduction to Humanist Manifesto 1, we find these words: "Religions the world over are under the necessity of coming to terms with the new conditions." Humanist Manifesto's 2 introduction, it gets even more bold. What are these new conditions that Humanist Manifesto of 1 of 1933 is talking about? Well, Humanist Manifesto makes it point blank clear, and again written in 1973, when it says, quote, "The next century can be and should be a humanistic century." And then it goes on to say, "We stand at the dawn of a new age." New Ageism is nothing but an extension of humanism. There certainly is nothing new under the sun, because New Ageism, again, is just nothing but an extension of humanism, and humanism is just a respectable title for the sin of man. Now think about this. All sin, willful sin that is, all sin is the dethroning of God and the deifying of man. All sin, again, just visualize what's taking place. All sin, willful sin, is the dethroning of God and the deifying of man. When we willfully sin, we are in essence saying, "Lord, not thy will be done, but mine which is here on earth." Just the opposite of what Christ prayed when facing the cross in the garden. That is in essence what we do when we willfully sin. We're saying, "Lord, I don't want your will done in my life. I don't choose to obey your commandments. I choose to do what I want to do. We elevate ourselves in the place of lordship. We remove Christ out of our lives, if we've ever had him there to begin with. And we put ourselves upon the throne, at least at that moment of willful sin. And that's all that humanism and New Ageism. It's just the sin. It just goes back to the age-old sin of man. Now, where did all this begin? Well, it began, as we've talked about in the past, in Genesis chapter 3, verses 1 through 6. And this time I'd like to go back there and examine this passage in a little bit more detail. Genesis chapter 3, starting with verse 1. It says, Now the serpent was more crafty than any beast of the field which Yahweh God had made. And he said to the woman, Indeed has God said, You shall not eat from any tree of the garden. And the woman said to the serpent, From the fruit of the trees of the garden we may eat, but from the fruit of the tree which is in the middle of the garden, God has said, You shall not eat from it, or touch it, lest you die. And the serpent said to the woman, You surely shall not die. For God knows that in the day you eat from it, your eyes will be opened, and you will be like God, knowing good and evil. What was he promising to Eve and Adam at this time? He was saying, you can be God. You can dethrone God. You can become just like him with all his power and with all his knowledge. You can dethrone God and you can deify yourself if you'll just accept the lie. And then notice in verse 6 it says, When the woman saw that the tree was good for food, and that it was a delight to the eyes, and that the tree was desirable to make one wise, she took from its fruit and ate, and she gave also to her husband with her, and he ate. Did you notice how her sin is described? It was good for food, it was a delight to the eyes, and it was desirable to make one wise. Now keep your finger there in Genesis 3. We might want to come back to it. And turn to 1 John chapter 4. Excuse me, 1 John chapter 2. First John chapter 2 and verses 15 through 17. It says, Do not love the world nor the things of the world. If anyone loves the world, the love of the Father is not in him. And then verse 16, For all that is in the world, the lust of the flesh, and the lust of the eyes, and the boastful pride of life, is not from the Father, but is from the world. And the world is passing away, and also its lust, but the one who does the will of God abides forever. Notice here that the person who lives in the world, if there was ever a religion of the world, humanism and New Ageism is that religion. And it says that it describes the religion of the world as being involved in the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and the boastful pride of life. Well, where did that begin? Well, if you go back to Genesis 3 and verse 6 once again, you'll find that this is where it began. And when the woman saw that the tree was good for food, lust of the flesh, and that it was a delight to the eyes, lust of the eyes, and that the tree was desirable to make one wise, boastful pride of life, she took from its fruit and ate, and she gave also to her husband with her, and he ate. And then the eyes of the both of them were open, and they knew that they were naked, and they sewed fig leaves together and made themselves loin coverings. And we know that then God approached them and dealt with them for their transgression, dealt with them for the deifying of themselves, and the dethroning or the attempt of dethroning God from their lives, from their hearts and their minds. Where does New Ageism begin? Well, it certainly is humanistic in its foundation. And where does it begin? It all goes all the way back to Genesis chapter 3. It goes all the way back to the beginning. And yet they want to claim that it's new. There's nothing new about New Age. Let me just throw this in for extra. Ever since Genesis 3, man has been practicing, if you allow me, New Ageism, quote unquote. Ever since Genesis 3, man has been practicing. Romans 5 makes it very clear. It says, And as one man sinned, we've all sinned, and we all must die. And from Genesis 3 on, man has been practicing, quote unquote, New Ageism, ever since the Garden of Eden. Well, what is necessary? And I'm just throw this in for extra, but what is necessary in order for us to break that cycle that began in Genesis chapter 3? Well, just the opposite. The only thing that'll break that transgression The deifying of man and the dethroning of God is just the opposite. The dethroning of self and the deifying of God, once again, as God intended it always to be. As we find in Luke chapter 9. Let's just turn there real quickly. People often ask the question of what do I do? What do I need to do in order to follow God? What do I need to do to have that relationship with God that man lost all the way back there in the garden? Well, what's necessary? Well, that question was asked of Christ here in Luke chapter 9. In verse 23 beginning, he says, "And he was saying to them all, if anyone wishes to come after me, let him do what? Let him deny himself and take up his cross daily and follow me." Let's keep in mind that at that point in time, today we use crosses for all kinds of different things. We hang them on our walls, and we put them on our buildings, and we hang them around our necks. But back then there was only one purpose for a cross. It was for crucifixion. And when Joshua said to take up the cross and follow me, he was saying, crucify yourself, die to yourself, deny yourself, and deify me once again in your life. Let me be Lord and King of your life rather than yourself. Verse 24 picks it up. It says, "For whoever wishes to save his life shall lose it. But whoever loses his life for my sake, he is the one who will save it. For what is a man profited if he gains the whole world and loses or forfeits himself? For whoever is ashamed of me and my words, of him will the Son of Man be ashamed when he comes in his glory and the glory of the Father and of the holy angels." Well, how do we break the cycle that began in Genesis 3? By doing just the opposite of what Adam and Eve did there at the beginning, as by denying self and enthroning Christ in our hearts and in our affections. 1 Peter 3:15 puts it so aptly when it says, "But in your hearts reverence the Christ as Lord," as Lord and King. You know, there's no question that willful sin, at the moment it's participated in, dethrones God and deifies man or deifies self. Humanism, very clearly, dethrones God and deifies man, as we found in Humanist Manifesto Humanist Manifesto 2, tenet number 1, which we've already read in previous message, but so aptly describes it when it says, quote, "As non-theists, we begin with humans, not God, nature, not deity. The sin of man dethrones God and deifies man. Humanism does the same, and New Ageism obviously does one and the same thing. It dethrones God and deifies man. Most of you are aware of what took place on December 31st, 1986, that was called the World of Instant Cooperation, sponsored by advocates of the New Age movement. Now, not everybody was aware that that event was sponsored by the New Age movements, but if you were alert at all to what was taking place on that particular time, you were aware that the New Age movement was completely behind what was taking place on this what was called or billed as the World Instant of Cooperation. This is the prayer, or what I'm going to share with you is part of the prayer that was recited at this event throughout the world. 500 is touted as the fact is touted that there were over 500 million people throughout the world that participated in this event at that moment in time. And at that moment of time, this is the prayer, or at least part of the prayer, that was being recited by these people involved in this momentous occasion, quote unquote. Quote, "Now is the time of the new beginning. I am co-creator with God, and it is a new heaven that comes, as the goodwill of God is expressed on earth through me." Let me read that again. I missed part of that. "Now is the time of the new beginning. I am co-creator with God, and it is a new heaven that comes, as the goodwill of God is expressed on the earth through me." And then a little bit later it picks up and he says, "I begin with me." Now that sounds awful familiar to what we found in Humanist Manifesto, tenet number 1, which I've already shared with you, that said again, as non-theists, we begin with humans, not God. And here in this prayer, this the reciting of this prayer, they basically say the same thing. Now, they don't finish it off and say that we begin with, that they don't end by saying what's said in Humanist Manifesto 2, tenet number 1, by saying that we begin with humans, not God. They didn't finish that way because I think more people would have been alert to what was going on. But they say it basically, they state their statement. They show where they come from by saying, I begin with me. And then it picks up and it says, I am a living soul, and the Spirit of God dwells in me as me. I and the Father are one, and all that the Father has is mine. In truth, I am the Christ of God. I don't know about you, but there is no way in my mind that doesn't do anything other than deify man and dethrone God. It's all one and the same. Listen to the words of Shirley MacLaine, who perhaps is the movement's most well-known and influential spokesperson. She says, listen to this, she says, you are everything. You are the universe. Man is co-creator with God of the cosmos. You must never worship anyone or anything other than self, for you are God. Again, sounds like she must have been reading Humanist Manifesto number 2 in its conclusion, where it says, at the present juncture of history, commitment to all humankind is the highest commitment to which we are capable. She says, for you are God, and then she continues, to love self is to love God. The total understanding and realization of myself. Again, it sounds like she's been this time reading Humanist Manifesto number 1, tenet number 9, where it says, humanist considers the complete realization of human responsibility to be the end or goal of man's life. She says, the total understanding and realization of myself might require eons for me to accomplish. Did you catch what she was saying there? Again, she says, the total understanding and realization of myself might require eons for me to accomplish. What was she saying? She's a believer in reincarnation, as is almost all New Age participants. She continues, but when that awareness is achieved, I will be aligned completely with that unseen divine force we call God. For me to deny that divine force now would be tantamount to denying that I exist. I know that I exist, therefore, in capitals, I am. I know that the God source exists, therefore it is. Since I am a part of that force, then I am that I am. End quote. There can be no question. Shirley MacLaine certainly represents the New Age movement very well. There can be no question that the New Age movement is no different than what we find in humanism. Matter of fact, they're even a little bit more bold, and no different than when it comes right down to just old willful sin of man. For willful sin, humanism, and New Ageism all together dethrone God and deify man. In light of that, truly, there is nothing new under the sun. And the New Age movement certainly is not new. It's as old as man's sin in the very beginning. We've shown now, at least briefly, what New Ageism is not. It's not new. Now let's see what New Ageism is. Let's begin by let me begin by just sharing some of the different names that the New Age movement goes by, because you may hear some of these different names and not even realize that what it is, because the New Ageism is certainly goes by different names, and there's no really controlled, like with humanism, they've got Humanist Manifesto number 1 and Humanist Manifesto number 2. There's nothing like that for the New Age movement, and so it's much loosely done up. And thus they go by many different names and by many different theories that all, of course, fit together. Let me just share some of the different names so that you're at least aware of how and what the New Age movement is described by. Known by the Aquarian Conspiracy, New Thought Religion, New Consciousness, the Transcendental Movement, the Human Potential Movement, New Spirituality, New Wave, and New Awareness. Those are all titles for the New Age movement. Now, let me share with you the easiest way for me to share. Since there is no document that is the authorized mouthpiece for New Ageism. The easiest way for me to really share with you what New Ageism is all about is simply to read some compilations of and descriptions of what New Age is. And rather than me just doing it, I want to share with you, because they've certainly probably done a much better job of researching than I was able to in the time allotted to me, the time available to me. But let me read to you a fact sheet on the New Age movement put out by the National Research Institute, which is a data center on the New Age. And their address, and I'll give you their address and phone numbers in case you want to follow up and research this a little bit further. They're located at 3095 D South Peoria in Aurora, Colorado, zip code 80014, and their telephone number is area code 303-745-7707. Let me just read some of what from this fact sheet, some of what they have accumulated on the New Age movement. To begin by saying, to help you to understand the fundamental concepts of the New Age movement, we have prepared this fact sheet for you. Keep in mind that this is merely a synopsis, so to speak, of this philosophy. The New Age movement is far too extensive and complex to cover in detail in a mere 2 pages. Hopefully this will aid in your understanding and encourage you to alert others. The New Age movement, known also by such titles as the Human Potential Movement, the New Wave, the New Consciousness, and the New Awareness, has been increasing in scope since the 60s when Hindu gurus brought the philosophy out of India and into the Western culture. It is a pagan worldview rooted in Hinduism, Buddhism, and Taoism, with ample doses of the occult. Its goal is to create a literal heaven on earth by the year 2000. In fact, the utopia it seeks to establish is a one-world government predicted in Fabian socialism. To those who are lost and spiritually searching, it is seductively attractive. New Age influence has permeated virtually every area of our society: self-help groups, health, entertainment, education, religion, industry, government, and media. The New Age movement is made up of a collection of thousands of networks operating throughout the world. Some of the most common are peace groups, environmental and hunger projects, nutrition, humanistic psychology, and outright occultism such as witchcraft. The goal of the New Age movement is threefold. One, world government, often described as a new world order. One world religion, heavenly, occultic, and certainly hostile to Christians and Muslims. And the one world Messiah. And when they talk about a one world Messiah, you can know for certain that they're not talking about Yahshua, our Messiah. The success of this philosophy since the 60s has been phenomenal. Over 60 million Americans in a country once regarded as Christian now accept the hopeless cycle of reincarnation as truth. Even worse, just a little bit later it goes on to say, even worse, New Age philosophy is creeping insidiously into Christian churches, seminaries, and schools. Picking up a little bit later, it says, some of the common features of the New Age philosophy are, all religions are the same path to the same end. Now that should strike a bell in your mind and should remind you of some of the things we've already covered as far as Masonry and humanism again. Again, all religions are the same path to the same end. Anti-Americanism, anti-nationalism, intolerance to Christianity, especially fundamentalism, strong rejection of most traditional values, deification of man, God as an impersonal force or one synonymous with the universe, God immanent in everything, each man is a natural Christ and co-creator with God, belief in evolution, belief in reincarnation, unlimited human, spiritual, and intellectual capacities, belief in a superior race, universal disarmament, redistribution of the world's resources, acceptance or reliance on non-traditional medicine. They've always got to throw something in this, right? Acceptance of Eastern mysticism and the occult, worship of Lucifer, the angel of light, anticipation of a New Age Messiah, and again not speaking of Yahshua the Christ. Deception is at the root of this occultic worldview. Thousands of innocent individuals throughout the world have been seduced into New Age ideology unwittingly, ignorant of its goals. the majority of the people in 1986 were unaware. The majority of the people who participated in that were unaware of their leaders' goals, as has been described here. Seemed like a good idea just to be praying for peace for the world. Moreover, thousands more worldwide are endorsing these goals and working with unprecedented devotion to bring them about. And it lists some of the chief organizations that are involved with or behind or promoting the New Age movement. Now, there's 38 that are listed here, and I'm sure, I don't know if this has a date on it, I'm sure since then there have been more added since then, but it lists 38. I won't read them all because some of them won't mean anything to you, but let me just read some of them that may strike a bell again. For example, involved with the New Age movement and promoting is the global, and some of these you may not recognize, but I think it's just the titles of the organizations I think you'll find interesting too. For example, Global Education Association. Global Education Association. Greenpeace is obviously one of those involved with the New Age movement. New Organization for an American Revolution. Another one, People for the American Way. Planetary Citizens. I don't know anything about them, but that certainly sounded awfully interesting. Planetary Citizens. The Sierra Club and WinStar Foundation, which is John Denver's organization. And Zero Population Growth, as we mentioned in last week's message. Then also one that you probably or likely haven't heard of, but that I want to just mention to you in a little bit more detail, and that is the Lucis Trust, L-U-C-I-S. I'm not sure I'm pronouncing that right. Formerly, at least 2 years before they changed the name, formerly known as the Lucifer Publishing Company. That again may alert you to some Masonic teachings and beliefs. Matter of fact, Masons were involved, at least initially, with the Lucifer Publishing Company. Now known as the Lucis Trust, certainly one of the most important organizations in the New Age network, without a question. Now, as of 1986, they had 6,000 active members. So keep that in mind. And including these people. And the list of people I'm going to read to you is what I'd call the who's involved in New Ageism. These are some of the members, some of the 6,000 members of the Lucis Trust. Henry Kissinger, Robert McNamara, David Rockefeller, James Baker III, supposed to be a good Christian man from what I understand, and on Dr. Dobson's show at one time, James Schlesinger, Donald Reagan, and George Shultz. I don't know about you, but that not only, to me, has not only would that describe the who's involved in New Ageism, it sounds like the who's involved in the Trilateral Commission and the Council on Foreign Relations as well. Now, the only two that I do not know whether they're members of the Council on Foreign Relations or the Trilateral Commission are James Baker III and James Schlesinger. Maybe some of you know whether they are or not. The others I know for certain are either involved with the CFR or the Trilateral Commission in one form or another. They're all members. And if you'll look at the Trilateral Commissions and the Council on Foreign Relations goals, they align perfectly with the goals of New Ageism. They're nearly one and the same. I thought you'd find that interesting. I'm sure there's some others that could be listed that would be right in that same crowd of people. Let me read you one other description. Again, I do this because they certainly probably will do a better job than I will personally, and it really puts it in a nutshell so that we can get through this material a little bit quicker. Let me give you another description of the New Age movement. This is in an article and under a heading entitled The New Age Mindset. It says, while the New Age movement is comprised of a diverse network of groups and individuals, it is fundamentally a mindset that defines a broad cultural shift taking place in our society. Apologists for the movement see the world entering or about to enter a new spiritual era. It says, these are some of the characteristics characteristic features of this New Age worldview. Cosmic humanism. Like the New Ager, the secular humanist places greater faith in man and his potential. However, the New Age movement represents a new form of humanism, what Douglas Gruthis terms cosmic humanism in his book Unmasking the New Age, InterVarsity Press, 1986. Gruthis describes the perspective of cosmic humanism as, quote, man is not only the measure of all things, he is the metaphysical master. We are one with the one and thus have access to unlimited potential, end quote. And you can see through all of this that humanism was just a step toward a greater degree of deception and a greater degree of deifying man and the dethroning of God. It just is always a step further. Also described as optimism. Deriving from their cosmic humanism and faith in human potential is the New Age movement's optimistic, almost utopian outlook. Humankind is self-determining and evolving in a profound positive direction. Again, you can see why so many of the positive mental attitude speakers today have a humanistic background and outlook in what they teach. Another one is described as holism. The New Age mindset rejects the divisions, the fractured existence, the broken vision that it says typifies the old order. Instead, the New Age worldview predicts a new holism, an integration, a coming together of science, personal experience, and spiritual vitality. It also can be seen as occultism. New Age thinking and practices are often characterized by hidden, mysterious knowledge. Now, that should clue you into something else that's often characterized by hidden and mysterious knowledge. Masonry, or the Kabbalah, some of those things seem to be one and the same here. Of course, keep in mind, as we've stated in past messages, all occult practices their roots can be found in the ancient Jewish Kabbalah. They all go back to there one way or another. It says, New Age thinking and practices are often characterized by hidden, mysterious knowledge. Spiritism, neo-paganism, including goddess worship, and Eastern mystical techniques of consciousness manipulation are widespread. Reincarnation, aura reading, and astra religion are commonplace. And also described as monism. The view that all is one and one is all is a basic assumption of New Age thinking. This idea holds that there is just one level of reality. God, the universe, the material world are one and the same. As Gruthis notes, quote, ultimately there is no difference between God, a person, a carrot, or a rock, end quote. Now, in a nutshell, that, and certainly only in a nutshell, that describes somewhat well the New Age movement and what they're really about. We're going to conclude with that. And in next week's message, we're going to take a deeper look at New Ageism as we found in the Bible. Again, obviously, just as is the case with communism, Masonry, and humanism, we're not going to find the word New Ageism or the New Age movement in the Scriptures. But we can certainly find different characteristics, as we already have started to in this message. We can certainly find different characteristics of New Ageism as in the Scriptures. If it's not new, you can just know that it's going to be found in the Scriptures. We'll take a deeper look at the New Ageism in the Bible, and then, of course, take a look at who is behind the New Age movement. I want to conclude this message this morning with the admonition as found in Ephesians chapter 5, if you turn there with me. Ephesians chapter 5 and verses 6 through 16. And, of course, this admonition is meant for more than just those participating in the New Age movement or those who are brushing shoulders today in today's society with the New Age movement. But it certainly applies well to the situation that we now face in the 20th century with the New Age movement in our midst. We'll take it in light of that. I'll just read it and use it as the admonition in light of what's going on today with New Ageism. Starting with verse 6, it says, "Let no one deceive you with empty words, for because of these things the wrath of God comes upon the sons of disobedience. Therefore do not be partakers with them. For you were formerly darkness, but now you are light in the Lord. Walk as children of light. For the fruit of the light consists in all goodness and righteousness and truth, trying to learn what is pleasing to the Lord. And do not participate in the unfruitful deeds of darkness, but instead even expose them. For it is disgraceful even to speak of the things which are done by them in secret. Keep in mind the secret societies and how they all fit in with all of this. For it is verse 12 again, for it is disgraceful even to speak of the things which are done by them in secret. But all things become visible when they are exposed by the light. For everything that becomes visible is light. For this reason it says, Awake, sleeper, and arise from the dead, and the Christ will shine on you. Therefore be careful how you walk, not as unwise men, but as wise, making the most of your time, because the days are evil. Certainly describes this day and age. Obviously described the time of Paul's day and age as well, but maybe even more so this day and age as we face so many tentacles of Mystery Babylon that are reaching out to destroy Christ and Christianity today. In light of that, or with that admonition, let's all stand and we'll go to our Heavenly Father in prayer. Heavenly Father, we ask at this time that, Father, you would direct and lead in each one of our lives personally. Father, also as a nation of people, specifically, Father, I pray for Israel that she once again would recognize who she is, that she would come to understand her identity. And then once understanding that she would be drawn to her commander-in-chief, Joshua the Christ. Father, once having done that, I pray that, Father, you'd alert her to her enemies and what they are about, to their designs against her and against you. Help Israel to be raised to be an army, Father, on your behalf, to fight for the cross of Christ, to take forth that banner and hold it against any opposition that would dare raise its head against you. Father, help us each individually, knowing that it begins with the individual. Father, I pray that the information that we're gleaning through this series, that we could be better equipped as individuals to serve you and to fight this battle and to recruit those who need to be a part of this army as well. Put these things in your hands and pray that you use all of this to your praise and glory. We ask these things into your Son, Yeshua. Amen.